Good morning.
Good morning.
About a year ago, we had our initial meeting with Reading is Fundamental, and they asked us one question. What impact, if any, does access to print materials have on children's educational outcomes? And they tasked us with trying to address this question by conducting a research review. Now, many policymakers, policy advocates, and even researchers might approach a task like this by simply going out and trying to find studies that support their position. We know that that's kind of the modus operandi here in Washington. And they probably draw on one or two studies that support their position, and they will cling to these studies. And so long as they have these studies in hand, they can claim that they're making research-based decisions. The approach that we took for this research review is quite different. What if we tried to uncover all the research ever conducted on this subject and tried to extract all the research findings, translate them all into a single metric, an effect size, and that way try to estimate what the overall impact is across all research studies? That is our approach to this study. So a lot of these points I've already made. For non-rigorous research reviews, reviewers will go out and they'll try to find research studies that support their positions. They might find a multitude of studies, but they will cherry pick the ones that match their preconceptions on this matter. They might choose studies based on whether or not they have statistically significant findings. And finally, sometimes they confuse causation and correlation. And those of us in the research world know that there's a big difference between correlation and causation. Causation, you need to depend on rigorous research studies to make those causal linkages between variables. For our approach, for the rigorous research review, however, we tried to uncover every single study ever conducted on this subject. And given that, any particular study is only going to represent one data point among a population of data points. And we don't just focus on whether findings are statistically significant or not significant. Our task is to try to translate all research findings into a single metric, an effect size. And by looking at those effect sizes, we can try to estimate the overall magnitude of effects. This is basically, you've heard the expression bang for the buck, right? Well, this answers the bang question. What is the impact, the overall impact of these types of programs and interventions? And finally, we make a careful distinction between those studies that are rigorous, that use research designs that are capable of detecting causal relationships or determining whether a program actually has an impact, versus those that are just looking at general relationships. And this last point kind of goes into the underlying research studies for this project. Number one is we look at the overall relationships. This is all the research studies that are relevant and have research findings. So the first question is, what is the overall relationship? The second is, what is the relationship among those studies that are rigorous, that are actually looking at particular programs or interventions? And finally, our third research question focused on programs and interventions that are most like Reading is Fundamental. These are programs that actually distribute books to children. What are the impacts of those types of programs? Okay, now I've got this flow chart up on the diagram here, up on the board here, and I'm just going to breeze through this. The main point of this is in the actual report. But the main point of this is that we tried to uncover every single study ever conducted on this subject. we took multiple approaches to trying to find these studies. We scoured through 16 different research databases. We tried to contact researchers for published and unpublished studies that may never have made it into print. We tried to get every single study ever conducted. We also had a rigorous screening process to make sure that the studies that finally did make it into our final analysis were actually relevant to this subject and had primary research findings. And I'm moving ahead of myself here. And by the end of the day, we had 108 studies altogether. These 108 studies, we coded these studies. We tried to look at the features of the studies. We looked at the samples of children that they looked at. We looked at the setting in which the studies were conducted. We looked at the features of the interventions themselves. We looked at the research design that was used so that we could make this distinction between rigorous studies and non-rigorous studies. And we also looked at the types of outcomes that were examined in these studies. Overall, we found 58 different types of outcomes. I'll talk about that in a minute or so. And we also extracted effect sizes from these studies. And for effect sizes, we used the mean standardized difference. Basically, this represents the difference between the scores for an intervention group minus the scores for a control group divided by the standard deviation. So basically, for all the research findings, we could translate all these findings into a single type of metric. And per recommended practices among meta-analysis experts, we followed a series of analytic steps. Number one, we weighted the effect sizes by the size of the study. Basically, we have more confidence in those research findings that are based on large numbers of children than those research findings based on smaller numbers of children. And that's what that weight represents. There's some adjustments that could be done to those weights. Basically, these adjustments make our research findings more conservative. That is, it's less likely that we can find significant impacts because we've got these adjustments in there. For our analysis, we only allow one effect size per independent sample. And finally, at the end of the day, we calculated the average weighted effect size and the confidence interval. Okay, this is getting kind of technical, I know, but I'll show you the findings, and then we'll kind of go back to this, these details here. I said 58 different types of outcomes that we looked at. To make our analysis more simple, we grouped these into 8 categories. Some outcomes dealt with attitudes towards reading or attitudes towards academics. Some examined motivation to read or children's interest in reading. Some examined reading behavior. This includes things like frequency of reading or the amount of time spent reading. Basic language development. This is whether children can express themselves or understand language that's posed to them. Emergent literacy skills. These are the building blocks of reading. These include things like understanding being able to identify letters, understanding the sounds that go along with letters, being able to track print from left to right, and so forth. Reading performance. This is probably the most policy relevant outcome that I'm going to present today. These are the standardized achievement scores for children. This could include reading comprehension, vocabulary. This could include teachers' informal assessment of children's reading abilities. There's also writing performance and a catch-all category of other types of academic achievement indicators. These could be grade retention, grade promotion, achievement gaps, graduation rates, things of that nature. Okay, here are the results. You'll recall that the first research question dealt with overall relationships. So this does not get to the impact question. This is just overall relationships. And to cut to the chase here, the green boxes show significant impacts. For those of you who are statistically savvy, you know that the confidence intervals in each one of these boxes, none of them contain the value 0. So we conclude that there's a relationship between children's access to print and each one of these 8 outcomes. This is the question about impacts of programs that facilitate children's access to print material. These could be book lending programs. These could be book ownership programs like Reading is Fundamental. And in this case, we found positive impacts for 4 of the 8 outcomes. These include attitudes, reading behaviors, emergent literacy skills, and reading achievement. Now the gray boxes, you'll notice, if you can see, all of the average weighted effect sizes are in the positive range. However, because of the confidence intervals, because they include the value 0, we cannot conclude that there's a relationship there. And I just want to mention that on the far right side at the bottom, it says other achievement. We only found one study that addressed that outcome in a rigorous way. And so we didn't even make any conclusions based on one study. This is a meta-analysis, after all. Finally, research question number 3, the magnitude of effects for programs like Reading is Fundamental. And basically, these results mirror the ones that I just presented. Programs that distribute books and other types of print material to children have impacts on children's attitudes towards reading, towards their motivation to read, reading behavior, emergent literacy skills, and reading achievement. All right. So thus far, I've presented a lot of statistics. And I just want to try to put some of these effect sizes in perspective here. What constitutes a big effect? What constitutes a small effect? Well, one way that we can examine that is by trying to put it in perspective with the types of outcomes that we're familiar with. One type of outcome that we might be familiar with is the annual growth of reading in children. Okay? For those of you who are parents here, you've probably seen your children in grades 1 and early elementary grades really take off in reading. They learn a lot during their first few years. But as they get older, the average annual impact of reading, their growth rate in reading diminishes. And that's what's reflected in the green bars up here. That in first grade, that effect size, this is over an entire year, that effect size is 1.52 standard deviations. And in 12th grade, that's the rightmost green bar, that's 0.06 standard deviations. Now you'll recall that the average impact that we found for reading achievement was 0.267 standard deviations. And that is roughly equivalent to the amount of growth that's demonstrated in children in the later elementary years and early middle school years. Let me try to put this in another perspective here. Your average educational intervention that is conducted in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, on average, the impact is 0.14 standard deviations for elementary schools, 0.11 for middle schools, and 0.10 for high schools. Contrast that with the impacts from our research review. Our research review, those are the orange bars. If you just look at the reading achievement bar, that's 0.267. That's roughly twice the impact of your average educational intervention in elementary schools. So in summary, we tried to gather every single study ever conducted on this subject of children's access to print and outcomes. I hope I've convinced you that our process was rigorous, that we had multiple checks within the system to make sure that we didn't miss any studies. The reports on programs that facilitate children's access to print material show positive impacts for attitudes, reading behavior, emergent literacy, and reading performance.